Call the police all you want, Marcus, but those engines are not starting. I stood in the pouring rain, watching my former boss scream at a blank control panel. Just 12 hours after he fired me to avoid paying my bonus, the entire multi-million-dollar job site died. 6 months before that rainy morning, I was standing in the middle of a muddy field that was supposed to become the Ridgeview Commercial Plaza. My name is Dave Vance. At 48 years old, I have spent 22 years running commercial construction projects along the Gulf Coast. I have got permanent creases in my work boots, scars from flying slag, and a deep-seated appreciation for clean welds and solid foundations. For 8 years, I was a senior site superintendent for Caldwell Development, back when the company was run by its founder, Richard Caldwell. Richard was an old-school contractor who started with a single dump truck and built an empire. He knew that the only way to keep a project on budget was to treat your subcontractors with respect, pay your bills on time, and listen to the guys wearing the mud-stained boots. We had worked together on the expansion of the Baytown refinery complex, a brutal project where we faced hurricanes and material shortages, but we finished on time because Richard stood by his word. But by the time the ground was cleared for the $45 million Ridgeview Plaza, Richard had stepped back due to his health, leaving the daily operations to his 32-year-old son, Marcus. Marcus had a freshly minted MBA from a prestigious East Coast school, a collection of custom-tailored suits, and a complete lack of field experience. To Marcus, a construction site was not a collection of skilled tradesmen working under hazardous conditions. It was an optimization model that could be managed entirely through spreadsheets and tracking software. Within his first month as project director, Marcus mandated the use of a proprietary software platform called SitePulse. Every laborer, foreman, and subcontractor was required to install the app on their personal phones so the system could track their GPS locations. Marcus also installed cellular-linked cameras on the light towers to monitor crane cycle times down to the second. He would call my field trailer from his air-conditioned office in Dallas, demanding to know why Crane 3 had been idle for 12 minutes. Completely ignorant of the fact that the crew was holding lift operations because the wind gusts at 150 feet had exceeded 25 miles per hour. A week before the concrete pour, Marcus's automated software flagged a group of steel workers as inactive because they were clustered in one spot, triggering a false safety alarm that shut down the North Quadrant for 4 hours. In reality, the men were conducting a mandatory safety briefing for a high-stress critical lift. The Ridgeview Plaza was on a knife-edge schedule. The anchor tenant agreements stipulated that if Phase 1, consisting of the deep excavation, concrete footings, and structural steel framing was not completed and certified by the bank's independent engineer, by October 15th, the tenants could walk away. A lease termination of that scale would trigger an immediate default clause on our $30 million construction loan, collapsing the entire development. Richard Caldwell knew the stakes. When he asked me to run the site, he personally negotiated my contract. Under Clause 7.4, the company agreed to pay me a $150,000 milestone bonus if Phase 1 was certified on or before October 15th. That money was my retirement security, a chance to pay off the mortgage on my home, and the college fund for my granddaughter. I had worked 80-hour weeks for 6 months to make sure we hit that date. The critical assets on my site were our heavy equipment. We were running 4 Liebherr 280 ECH tower cranes to lift the heavy structural steel, and 6 Caterpillar 336 excavators to manage the deep foundation trenches. In a booming Houston market, finding high-capacity machinery was almost impossible. I had secured the entire fleet through my lifelong friend, Thomas Miller, owner of Miller Equipment Rentals, LLC. The monthly lease fee was $45,000, a massive expense but a necessary one. By late August, however, Marcus implemented a cash preservation directive. To make the corporate quarterly balance sheet look better to the lenders, he began systematically delaying accounts payable. Tom Miller's lease invoices were pushed to the bottom of the stack. By October, Caldwell Development was 60 days delinquent on the lease, owing Miller Rentals $280,000 in unpaid fees and late penalties. Tom drove his truck to my site trailer in early October, his face dark with frustration. He showed me the past due notices and explained that his bank was threatening to audit his own equipment acquisition loans because of the unpaid balances. He told me he was preparing to demobilize his cranes and excavators by the end of the week. If Tom pulled the cranes, the project was dead, and my $150,000 bonus would vanish. I sat Tom down, poured him a cup of coffee, and gave him my word. I told him that the bank's milestone funding would release the moment. Phase 1 was certified on the 15th, and I would personally ensure his check was cut and wired before any other vendor was paid. Tom trusted me, and based solely on our friendship, he agreed to leave the machines on site. October 13th was a nightmare of rain and mud. I spent 20 hours straight on my feet, walking the iron decks with the ultrasonic welding inspection crew, checking the torque specifications on thousands of high-strength structural bolts. My knees were swollen, my boots were waterlogged, and my lungs were burning from the damp air, but we pushed through the night. At 2 p.m. on October 14th, the bank's independent structural engineer, Mr. Henderson, completed his final walkthrough. He checked the concrete cylinder test logs, verified the anchor bolt torque values, and reviewed the steel inspection reports. He signed and stamped the Phase 1 certificate of completion. The stamp read, October 14. We had beat the deadline by 24 hours. I walked over to the main double-wide office trailer, holding the signed document. I knocked and entered Marcus's office. He was sitting behind his mahogany desk, his laptop open. I placed the certificate on his desk and told him that Phase 1 was certified, the funding would release tomorrow, and we needed to wire Tom Miller his $280,000 immediately. I also mentioned that I looked forward to my bonus check. Marcus did not look at the certificate. Instead, he reached into his desk drawer and slid a white envelope across the table. Inside was a termination letter, citing operational restructuring, effective at 5 p.m. that day, October 14th. I stared at the letter, then looked at Marcus. I asked him what this was. I told him we had just completed Phase 1 ahead of schedule, and the project was a success. Marcus leaned back, adjusting his silk tie. He told me that under Clause 7.4 of my contract, the milestone bonus was only payable to the active site superintendent on the date of October 15th. Since my termination was effective on the 14th, I would not be an employee on the 15th, making me ineligible for the payout. He explained that a younger supervisor from a corporate firm would take over tomorrow, but since the new supervisor had not overseen Phase 1, he would not receive the bonus either. The company was simply pocketing the $150,000. Marcus was acting on a legal memorandum from a junior in-house attorney who argued that because Texas was an at-will employment state, the company could terminate my contract at any time prior to the bonus vesting date without legal liability. They believed the literal wording of the date clause protected them from a breach of contract claim. I felt a surge of anger, my fists clenching, but I forced myself to take a slow breath. I knew that Marcus wanted me to yell or throw a punch, so he could call site security and have me arrested, which would give him a legal reason to void my contract for cause. I simply picked up my personal canvas bag. I packed my tools, my hard hat, and my personal leather logbook, which contained all my daily notes, concrete delivery receipts, and Marcus's emails instructing me to delay payments to Tom Miller. As the security guard escorted me to the parking lot, I looked at Marcus and told him he was making a catastrophic mistake. He laughed, telling me that dinosaurs like me did not understand how modern business worked. I climbed into my truck and drove out of the gate, immediately dialing Tom Miller's direct number. I parked my truck in a quiet gravel lot a mile down the road from the job site, letting the engine idle as the rain began to beat against the windshield. I dialed Tom Miller's direct line. When he answered, I could hear the background roar of a diesel generator from his repair shop. I took a deep breath and laid out the entire sequence of events. Mr. Henderson signing the certificate on the 14th, my meeting with Marcus, and the termination letter designed to cheat me out of my $150,000 milestone bonus. There was a long silence on the line, the hum of the generator the only sound. Then Tom spoke, his voice low and vibrating with anger. He did not curse. Instead, he told me that Marcus had not just cheated me. He had used my personal integrity as a shield to keep his equipment running. Marcus knew that Tom was only carrying the $280,000 debt because of my word. He told me to drive straight to his warehouse office in East Houston. Tom's office was located in a metal-clad industrial park near the ship channel, smelling of gear oil, welding fumes, and strong coffee. When I walked in, Tom was already sitting at a scarred laminate conference table. Next to him was Sarah Jenkins, a sharp corporate attorney who specialized in construction contract disputes along the Gulf Coast. Sarah had a reputation for dissecting bad contracts and holding predatory developers accountable. I handed Sarah my termination letter and the certified copy of the Phase 1 certificate. She read both documents twice, her pen tracing the lines of Clause 7.4 of my employment agreement. She explained that Marcus's legal strategy was incredibly foolish. In Texas, while the at-will employment doctrine allows an employer to fire an employee at any time, courts have repeatedly ruled that an employer cannot terminate an employee for the sole purpose of avoiding the payment of commissions or bonuses that have already been fully earned. Because the independent engineer had certified the completion of Phase 1 on October 14th, my right to the milestone payment had legally vested. The work was done, the bank was releasing the funds, and the company owed me the debt. However, Sarah pointed out the harsh reality of the legal system. Filing a breach of contract lawsuit would take 12 to 18 months to reach a trial. During that time, Caldwell Development could restructure, shift their assets to another LLC, or file for bankruptcy protection, leaving me with a worthless piece of paper and thousands of dollars in legal fees. We needed immediate, undeniable leverage. That leverage lay in Tom's equipment lease. Sarah turned her attention to the thick binder containing the lease agreement for the lever cranes and Caterpillar excavators. Caldwell Development was 60 days delinquent on payments, far exceeding the 45-day default grace period defined in the contract. Sarah explained the mechanics of Section 9.609 of the Texas Business and Commerce Code, which is Texas's adoption of the Uniform Commercial Code Article 9. Under this statute, when a commercial lessee defaults, the secured party or lessor has the absolute right to take possession of the collateral. The law allows for self-help repossession, meaning Tom could reclaim his cranes and excavators without a court order, but only if he could do so without a breach of the peace. Under Texas case law, a breach of the peace occurs if the debtor verbally objects, blocks access, or if the repossession involves force or entry into locked premises. If Tom's transport truck simply drove onto the Ridgeview site and Marcus's security guards ordered them to leave, Tom's crew would have to halt the repossession immediately. To prevent Marcus from blocking the recovery, Sarah drafted a formal notice of lease termination and demand for immediate repossession. She told us she would file this with the Caldwell corporate office at 8:10 a.m. the next morning, while simultaneously filing an emergency application for a writ of rep plevin in the Harris County District Court. The writ would authorize off-duty Harris County Sheriff deputies to accompany Tom's transport teams, providing a legal presence that would prevent Marcus's security guards from interfering without facing arrest for obstruction. But organizing the physical recovery of 4 tower cranes and 6 large excavators was a massive logistical challenge. We needed 12 heavy-duty lowboy trailers, oversized transport permits from the Texas Department of Transportation, and a specialized crew of riggers and mechanics to dismantle the massive leaper cranes. It would take at least 36 hours to coordinate the logistics. In the meantime, Sarah pointed out that UCC Section 9.609A2 also permits the lessor to render the equipment unusable on the debtor's premises. Tom turned to his desktop computer and opened the fleet management portal. Tom's rental fleet was completely modernized. The 6 Caterpillar 336 excavators were equipped with Product Link, a cellular and satellite telemetry package. The 4 Liebherr 280 ECH tower cranes used Liebherr's proprietary LiDAT system. These telemetry modules did not just track running hours and engine codes. They were integrated directly into the machine's electronic control modules. On the monitor, The satellite map of Houston displayed 10 bright green icons clustered in the center of the Ridgeview Plaza site, indicating the machines were active and reporting data. Tom explained that the telematics control unit acted as an electronic gatekeeper. It was wired directly into the main starter motor relay and the fuel solenoids. If disabled, the starting circuit remained open, and the engine control unit refused to actuate the fuel injectors. No mechanical key, hotwire attempt, or diagnostic bypass could start the engine. Tom selected the 10 machines on his screen, opened the security control menu, and initiated the remote engine disable sequence. The system prompted him for his master administrator security code. Tom typed in his code and clicked the confirm button. On the map, the green icons representing the cranes and excavators turned orange as the satellite signals were transmitted. Within 3 minutes, as the electronic control modules on the construction site received the encrypted lockout command, the icons on the screen turned a solid flashing red. The dashboard status read, "Ignition disabled by fleet administrator." Tom closed his laptop and looked at me. He told me that when the new supervisor walked onto the site tomorrow morning, the cranes and excavators would be nothing more than metal statues. The next day, October 15th, was the scheduled start of Phase 2 utility work, and the morning of October 16th was the critical concrete pour for the main deck. Without those cranes to lift the concrete buckets, the entire schedule would collapse. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9:30 p.m. on the evening of October 14th. The trap was set, and the countdown had begun. At 6:30 on the morning of October 15th, the new site supervisor, Brad, stood in the mud at the center of the Ridgeview job site. He was 28 years old, fresh out of a university construction management program, and wore a spotless white hard hat alongside a high-visibility vest that still had its stiff packing creases. He had been instructed by Marcus to begin Phase 2 excavation immediately. Around him, the crane operators climbed the vertical ladders of the Liebherr Tower, cranes, and the heavy equipment operators climbed into the Caterpillar 336 excavators. Within 5 minutes, the site's radio channel was filled with static and confused chatter. The operators turned their ignition keys, but the massive diesel engines remained dead silent. On every digital dashboard screen, a flashing red warning indicator appeared. Critical fleet lockout, contact owner. Brad ran from machine to machine, growing increasingly frantic. He ordered our lead field mechanic, Gary, to bypass the ignition switches and hotwire the excavators. Gary, a veteran of 30 years in the dirt, stood by his service truck, took a sip of his coffee, and flatly refused. Gary explained that the Caterpillar engines used encrypted CAN bus electronic control modules linked directly to the GPS transponders. If anyone tried to jump the starter solenoid terminal, the system would register a critical security fault, shut down the fuel rail pressure regulator, and open the main circuit breaker. Gary warned him that trying to bypass the lockout could fry the main engine controller board, a $15,000 component, and void the manufacturer's warranty. Up in the main double-wide office trailer, Marcus was screaming into his telephone. He tried to call Miller Equipment Rentals, but his calls were automatically forwarded to Sarah Jenkins' law firm. A receptionist at the firm emailed Marcus a PDF copy of our formal notice of lease termination and demand for repossession, citing Section 9.609 of the Texas Business and Commerce Code. Marcus dismissed the document, calling it a cheap bluff. He spent the rest of the day calling other equipment rental companies in the Houston area, including United Rentals and Sunbelt, trying to secure replacement machinery. But the Houston construction boom had emptied every equipment yard in the county. When the rental dispatchers heard that Caldwell Development was on credit hold and that they needed 4 tower cranes and 6 excavators mobilized within 24 hours, they laughed and hung up. The real disaster struck on the morning of October 16th, the day of the massive concrete pour for the Phase 2 deck. We had scheduled 18 transit mixer trucks from Texas Concrete Corp. To deliver over 200 cubic yards of wet concrete. The concrete mixers arrived in a steady line, their heavy drums turning slowly to prevent the mix from separating. The concrete pump trucks were parked in position, but they could not begin the pour. They needed the Liebherr Tower cranes to lift the concrete buckets to the upper deck, and they needed the Caterpillar excavators to manage the soil pressure on the retaining walls near the pump stabilizers. The concrete we were using was a high, early-strength mix containing cement, water, fly ash, and aggregate. Because of Houston's high humidity and the warm 82-degree morning temperature, the chemical reaction of cement hydration was accelerated. The concrete dispatchers had added a chemical retarder admixture to the mix, but it only extended the working life of the wet concrete to 90 minutes. If the concrete was not discharged within that window, the heat of hydration would cause it to cure inside the steel drums. Once the concrete hardened, the drums would be destroyed, resulting in $25,000 in damage per truck, plus the cost of the lost concrete. Within an hour, the access road was completely blocked by the 18 concrete trucks. The gridlock spilled onto the main municipal roadway, Ridgeview Boulevard, bringing local morning traffic to a standstill. 2 Houston Police Department cruisers arrived with lights flashing. The police sergeant issued a municipal citation to Brad for blocking a public right-of-way, ordering him to either dump the concrete or move the trucks immediately. Brad was standing in the mud, soaking wet in the rain, waving his arms as 3 different truck drivers jumped down from their cabs to confront him. They were yelling that they were not going to lose their trucks and their livelihoods because of his company's billing disputes. The dispatcher from Texas Concrete Corp was screaming over Brad's radio that they were going to dump the concrete right on the access road if the gate was not cleared in 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Marcus's corporate attorneys rushed to the Harris County Courthouse to file an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order, attempting to force Tom Miller to unlock the machines. However, Sarah Jenkins was already in the judge's chambers. She presented Judge Arthur Vance with the lease agreement, the 60-day past due invoices, and our formal default notices. In the courtroom, Marcus's attorney argued that the lockout was a breach of contract that would cause irreparable financial harm to the developer. But Judge Vance cut him off, asking why the developer had not paid the rental invoices for 60 days. The attorney tried to claim it was an administrative oversight, but Sarah presented emails showing Marcus had intentionally delayed the payments. The judge noted that the developer had unclean hands, making them ineligible for equitable relief, and flatly denied Marcus's petition, stating that a court of equity would not grant emergency relief to a developer who had knowingly defaulted on his commercial lease payments. I sat in my truck at the gas station across the street, watching the gridlock and the flashing police lights. At 7:15, my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. When I answered, Marcus did not speak. He screamed. He accused me of sabotage, of hacking the machines, and of conspiring to ruin the project. He threatened to file criminal charges and sue me for every dime I had. I took a sip of coffee and let him finish his tirade. I told him that I did not hack anything. I reminded him that he had terminated my employment on the 14th, meaning I had no access to the site and no control over the machinery. The lockout was a standard commercial enforcement of UCC Article 9 by Tom Miller. I told him that his arrogance had broken the only agreement keeping those cranes on his site, and that Tom's recovery flatbeds were already on the road, accompanied by sheriff deputies to execute the repossession. I hung up the phone and watched the first heavy-duty flatbed haulers turn the corner onto the access road. At 7:30 a.m., the heavy hiss of air brakes cut through the sound of the pouring rain as Tom's convoy arrived at the main gate. 12 massive lowboy flatbed trailers, flanked by utility service trucks and a team of certified riggers, lined up directly behind the idling concrete mixers. Accompanying the convoy were 3 marked Harris County Sheriff's patrol cars. 3 off-duty deputies, hired as a private security detail to maintain order and prevent a breach of the peace, stepped out of their vehicles, their yellow rain slickers dripping in the wet air. Marcus ran out of the office trailer, slipping in the deep mud and losing his footing, his clean white hard hat tumbling into the muck. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive suit covered in dirt, and began screaming at the deputies. He pointed at the flatbeds, demanding that the officers arrest Tom's drivers for trespassing, vandalism, and the theft of company assets. The lead deputy, a veteran sergeant with a gray mustache, did not flinch. He adjusted his gear belt, looked down at Marcus, and pulled a laminated folder from his jacket. He showed Marcus the lease agreement, the payment default logs, and the formal UCC Article 9 repossession notice. The sergeant explained that this was a civil repossession of leased equipment due to non-payment, which was entirely legal under Texas law. He warned Marcus that the deputies were there to ensure no breach of the peace occurred. He told Marcus that if he or his security guards tried to block the trailers, touch the machinery, or interfere with the mechanics, they would be arrested immediately for obstructing law enforcement and disorderly conduct. Marcus stood frozen in the rain as the transit mixers continued to honk their horns. The Texas Concrete Corp dispatcher was screaming over Brad's radio that the drums had to be unloaded immediately or the drivers would dump the concrete to prevent the drums from curing. Just then, a black Ford Expedition pulled up to the office trailer steps. Richard Caldwell, the 68-year-old founder of the company, stepped out. He was wearing his old muddy work boots and a worn canvas jacket. He had flown from Dallas on a private charter the moment the bank's loan officer notified him of the site freeze, the municipal police citations, and the imminent loan default. Richard walked straight to Marcus and demanded an explanation for the chaos. Marcus tried to stammer that Dave and Tom had conspired to sabotage the project. I walked over from the gas station, holding a manila folder. I greeted Richard, whom I had worked with for 8 years, and handed him the papers. Inside was the certified Phase 1 completion certificate signed by the engineer on the 14th, the email records of Marcus delaying Tom's payments, and my termination letter signed by Marcus. Richard read the documents in the rain. He looked at the completion certificate, then at the termination letter. He realized that Marcus had fired me one day before the milestone date, just to avoid paying the $150,000 bonus, breaking the agreement I had made with Tom and freezing the entire $45 million project. Richard turned to Marcus with pure rage. He told Marcus he was an absolute idiot. He asked if saving $150,000 was worth risking a $30 million construction loan and the company's reputation. Marcus tried to argue about corporate cash flow, but Richard cut him off. He told Marcus he was fired, effective immediately, and ordered him to pack his things and get off the job site. Marcus turned and walked to his car in the rain, completely defeated. Richard then turned to Tom Miller. He apologized for his son's actions and asked what was required to unlock the machinery and send the flatbeds away. Tom told him he wanted the $280,000 in overdue lease payments, plus a $50,000 mobilization and reactivation fee to override the telematics lockouts. Richard pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking slightly in the cold rain. He dialed his corporate CFO on speakerphone. He ordered him to bypass the standard 3-signature approval process for emergency wires and execute an immediate Fedwire transfer of $330,000 to Miller Equipment Rental's corporate account. He read the routing and account numbers directly from Tom's lease folders. The CFO tried to explain that they needed formal board authorization for a transfer of that size, but Richard roared into the phone that the board would have no company left to govern if the project defaulted. Within 15 minutes, Tom's phone buzzed. Sarah Jenkins verified the Fedwire transaction sequence code, confirming the funds were cleared and irrevocable. Tom opened his laptop in his truck and entered the override codes. Within seconds, the red lockout indicators on the screen turned green. Across the site, the diesel engines of the Caterpillar excavators and the electric motors of the Lieber tower cranes roared to life. Richard turned to me, wiping rain from his forehead. He said, "Dave, I built this company from a single dump truck. I built it on trust and handshakes. What my son did is a disgrace to the family name. I need a veteran who knows how to run a job, not an MBA who manages by spreadsheets. I want you to step in as the project director for the entire Ridgeview Plaza, overseeing all phases." I told him I would return, but under new terms. I demanded a promotion to project director with a base salary of $200,000, the immediate payout of my $150,000 milestone bonus today. and a binding 3-year contract. I also demanded Clause 8B, a double multiplier severance clause stating that if the company terminated my contract without cause, they would have to pay me 2 years of salary and bonuses immediately, backed by a corporate lien on the Ridgeview property title. Finally, I required a written letter of apology from the board of directors. Richard looked at the concrete trucks finally backing into the pump bays as the cranes began lifting the concrete buckets. He nodded, shook my hand, and agreed to the terms. We walked into the office trailer and signed the new contract. As I walked back out to the gravel yard to supervise the pour, the rain began to clear. Marcus's greed had cost his company $330,000 and his own job, while securing my promotion, a massive salary increase, and the largest bonus of my career. I adjusted my hard hat and went back to work.